In this video, I'm going to focus on Beck's idea of the risk society and reflexive modernization. So Ulrich Beck, who you can see here on the slide, was a German sociologist and probably best known for his work on global risk society. So the book Risk Society was first published in the German in 1986, and that was also the year of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And in the book, Beck argues that environmental crises, such as the disaster, could no longer be considered accidents outside of human control, but had become a key product of industrial societies. So these are socially generated risks. And as a consequence, in the modern era, in modernity, in a risk society, we feel particularly anxious about the future. So the key question for Beck is, how does the anticipation of a multiplicity of man-made futures and its risky consequences affect and transform the perceptions, living conditions, and institutions of modern societies? So Beck makes clear that risk and catastrophe are not the same thing. So risk is the anticipation of a catastrophe. So you can see how with something like climate change, this is very relevant in terms of the anxiety that we experience about it, because it's about the anticipation of what's to come. And I'll quote Beck here. He says, "The sociological point is, if destruction and disaster are anticipated, this might produce a compulsion to act. The social construction of a real anticipation of future catastrophes in the present, like climate change or financial crisis, can become a political force which transforms the world for better or worse." So this is interesting, right? Because what he's saying here is that we shouldn't actually be pessimistic about this, because this sort of anticipation of disaster could be a really mobilizing force to generate kind of more democratic engagement with everybody feeling the risk and more people kind of getting involved to try and address it. So it's not necessarily a pessimistic argument. So let's talk now about this distinction that Beck makes between first modernity and second modernity. So he argues that in the continued pursuit of progress or of economic growth, we have continued to produce more and more risks. So he sort of suggests that we're suffering from the side effects of the project of modernity. And he calls this a boomerang effect, because essentially our technological advancements are coming back to bite us. And you can see how this fits with industrial society and the carbon emissions that that's produced and how that is now causing warming. So these two phases of modernity that he distinguishes, in the first modernity, we're still kind of drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak. So this is when we're still seeing taking risks as advancing progress or being good for society. In second modernity, however, we become more reflexive or more critical about modernity, and we question the risks that are being taken. And so we're questioning some of these beliefs around these Enlightenment ideas of science and progress, etc. So today we encounter what Beck calls manufactured uncertainties of our own doing, and they are collectively imposed and individually unavoidable, which I think, is one of the key things with climate change, is that it's something that's imposed on all of us, and yet as individuals there's a limited extent to what we can do. So collectively imposed and individually unavoidable. He also suggests that the kind of risks we face today are 1, delocalized, so not limited to one particular place. 2, they're incalculable, so we can't really calculate or predict the consequences. And 3, they're non-compensable, so we can't just compensate people for these disasters to make it okay. Now, one of the most important points that Beck makes is that the impacts of global risks, like climate change, will not be experienced evenly. And as he puts it, the first law of global risk society is the risk of catastrophes haunts the poor. So regions of the world where problems like high population growth, poverty, pollution, and high levels of inequality are predicted to be more impacted by the changing climate. And this is something that we'll discuss further in the sway. One more angle on risk that Beck talks about is his idea of risk biographies, and this comes through more in his work on individualization. So what do we mean when we say individualization? So it's a process of social change. As societies modernize and globalize, individuals, people, become increasingly disembedded from traditional forms of support and constraint, like the family or ethnic group or neighbourhood, and are located instead as individuals in social, legal and welfare systems that foster and encourage independence. Rather than being prescribed by social norms, positions or roles, individuals have more choice as to how to construct their lives and identities. So essentially what this theory is arguing is that today we have more freedom to be who we want to be, so we're less kind of constrained by social norms and traditional rules. But the flip side of this is that we have to work out for ourselves amongst an array of possible options what we want to do, who we want to be, and this can potentially cause anxiety. So Beck and Beck Gernsheim, his wife, who you can see there, who was a well-known sociologist as well, they call this idea do-it-yourself biographies or risk biographies. So working out how you want to live, who you are, becomes an ongoing project, a reflexive project. So it's experimental and it requires reflection on one's own life. And in their words here, the life of one's own is a reflexive life. Social reflection, the processing of contradictory information, dialogue, negotiation, compromise, is almost synonymous with living one's own life. Active management is necessary for the conduct of life in a context of conflicting demands and a space of global uncertainty. So in this kind of era, processing and managing one's self and one's feelings and one's identity can lead to a kind of general feeling of restlessness. And other sociologists kind of make these arguments. Zygmunt Bauman, who's one who says we live in an age of uncertainty, which he calls liquid modernity. Another influential sociologist, Anthony Giddens, who you can see pictured here, wrote with Beck, and he makes a very similar argument, and he writes about the reflexive project of the self. He argues that it's become a challenge for people today to answer the question, who am I? And what we struggle to do is to create a kind of convincing self-narrative that will actually probably need to revise throughout life, because things like relationships and career, which perhaps used to be lifelong passions, are now more likely to only be short-term. So there's a lot of kind of remaking the self that we need to do. Now, Giddens suggests that this is not necessarily negative. It does kind of involve a lot of work on behalf of the individual, but it's also an opportunity for more freedom. Now, some of the critiques of these kinds of arguments are about the extent to which you can apply these ideas to everyone equally. So it's clear that our life chances and opportunities will vary significantly depending on things like class and gender and ethnicity. So this idea that we all have more freedom can, be quite easily critiqued in that way. I just want to finish here with one extension of this line of thinking around the kind of do-it-yourself biography, and this is this idea of emerging adulthood. So if we think about societies like Australia, kind of contemporary Western democracies, we have a cultural understanding of youth as being a period of emerging adulthood. So not quite adults yet, we're emerging into adults. So the late teenage years and the early 20s are sort of understood as a distinctive life phase where young people embark on a period of self-discovery and exploration and probably extended education before, quote, settling down and starting a family or settling into a career. So for example, gap years, where students take a year off to work or travel before commencing uni, These are often promoted and also understood by the people who do them as an opportunity for young people to construct a reflexive self-identity before pursuing a career. And this shift to understanding the early 20s in this way is pretty striking if you think about how different it is from norms in, say, even the 1970s, where most people would leave high school, immediately get a job, quite unlikely to go to uni at that time, and start a family soon after. So in 1974, for example, the average marrying age for men in Australia was 23 and for women was 21. Now, the average age of first marriage is about 32 for men and 30 for women. So essentially what we're seeing is a 10-year delay. And a big part of this is that it's much more common to go to uni and many more jobs require degrees just to get in the door. But there's other factors like obviously women entering the workforce in much greater numbers compared to the 70s. Other factors like housing affordability are things that are meaning that people are delaying having children. And so these broad structural factors are having a big influence, and it's meant that our cultural understanding of what you should do with your time in your 20s and the idea of youth has kind of extended out, and we get this idea of an emerging adulthood, which I think if you sort of talk to your grandparents perhaps about the expectations around them at that time, they would be pretty different. So I think this idea of emerging adulthood as a period of self-exploration is a good example of what Beck and Gernsheim and Giddens are talking about in terms of the reflexive project of the self, DIY biographies, and what it is to live in a risk society that's permeated by anxiety.